Yeah. So I'm Peter Juven. I'm the Dean of the Faculty at this place since only a recent period, since this summer. And it's my honor to introduce our speaker for today at this Athenaeum talk, Ambassador Stephen McGann, who is an alumnus of this college and also a member of the Board of Trustees. He is here in part because precisely the board is meeting later this week, and he accepted kindly to add a day of events, including this particular talk to his stay at the college here. So, Ambassador McGann serves as the senior advisor of the Dwight D. Eisenhower School for National Security and Resource Strategy at the National Defense University. NDU is one of the top institutions of higher learning that the Department of Defense has. And the Dwight D. Eisenhower School is a very well-known part of it. He was previously the Vice Chancellor of the College of International Security Affairs at NDU, again, focusing on building counterterrorism partnerships. And he's also an adjunct professor out there in the College of International Security Affairs. As an aside, he is currently also being charged by Department of Defense to direct a joint land, air, and sea strategic exercise program, where people from all of different academies and universities actually reflect on future challenges, future security challenges to the United States through doing actually simulation exercises. And this is obviously an important part of the process of thinking about not fighting the past war, the last war, but actually being ready for future challenges the country is facing. And so Ambassador McGann is directing that learning process as well. He's also a graduate of the Naval War College's 4th Joint Force Maritime Commander Component course. At the same time, interestingly enough, his career has primarily been in the Department of State. He was the United States ambassador to the Republics of Fiji, Nauru, Kiribati, and the Kingdom of Tonga and Tuvalu. From 2008 to 2011. He was also assigned as Chargé d'Affaires at the United States Embassy in Dili in Timor-Leste, one of the most recent countries to become independent in this world of ours. What's the last one, by the way? Yep. Good. South Sudan. Just checking. Much of his career has focused on democracy building, law enforcement cooperation, maritime security, humanitarian assistance, disaster preparedness and response, and of course, the U.S. diplomatic presence in the Pacific, where he has a lot of experience. As I said, he has a BA from Claremont, McKenna in 1973, went on to study at Cornell University, to earn a Master of Science there, and then also studied at the National Defense University. It's my honor to have Ambassador McGann speak to us today about the U.S. National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security, implementing United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325. Thank you very much for joining us.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Peter, thank you for that introduction. And I'm really pleased to be here this afternoon. You can well imagine what it was like for me as a student to be in the Athenaeum, not the Athenaeum. And I never thought about the possibility that one day that I would be on this side of the podium. So it really is great to be here, particularly since when I was sitting out there, it was just about in the last quarter of the 20th century. But anyway, today, what I want to do is discuss the importance of women, peace, and security as a critical element in our foreign policy. Now, you may wonder, why is it that I want to talk about women, peace, and security? Well, because it actually has become really a critical element in our planning and implementation of foreign policy. But we'll get into that further on. I do have some prepared remarks, which I have to read from, not because I want to read, but as I was putting together this speech, my assistant said, well, you got some really great sentences in here, Ambassador, and so I'm afraid if you don't read these remarks, you'll forget them. So, but, you know, when I joined the Foreign Service, I learned one thing, and that was everything that I knew about foreign policy, I actually learned at CMC. And this was important because as a Foreign Service officer, you really don't have time to go into textbooks and read lots of articles because you're busy drafting memos and cables. So the intellectual paradigm that I went through as a Foreign Service officer was all developed here. What I didn't know was how to create a framework for navigating the interagency in the foreign affairs bureaucracy, and especially the Department of State. So what we're going to try and do today is to give you a few shortcuts on how to do that, and women, peace, and security is going to be one of them. Now, the topic of women, peace, and security is a cross-cutting policy issue that will impact the thinking of future policymakers. When we discuss women, peace, and security, it's not a discourse on gender preference, gender promotion, or gender prerogatives. Equally as important, our thinking has to go beyond that, but we also have to include all vulnerable populations to protect them in war and peace. So, what is our goal? Our goal is to define an operational doctrine to undergird the development and implementation of strategies and policies that would lead to the successful formulation of a sustainable framework which would meet the foreign policy and security objectives of the United States and its global partners. That's one of those sentences that she wanted me to read, all right? So, but before we go into that deeply, let's start how I got here. And bearing in mind that your career always looks clearer in the rearview mirror than through the windshield. But my professional involvement with women's issues began in 1988 on my first assignment to our mission to the United Nations. There I served as the speechwriter and the action officer for the U.S. Ambassador Juliet McClennan, who was our ambassador to the Commission on the Status of Women. She was also the first person to receive ambassadorial rank for that job, and she was appointed by President George Herbert Walker Bush, Bush 41. Her early work was essential to the adoption and implementation of the U.S.-sponsored UNGA resolution calling for a substantial increase in women in senior UN positions. Now, the success of that resolution can be seen today because, as you are all aware, that there are greater calls now for Secretary General Ban Ki-moon to be replaced by a woman. After being appointed, I'm skipping a little bit, the Deputy Director for Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh during the period of 2000 to 2002, which some of you may remember was kind of a quiet period of American foreign policy. I had the opportunity to work closely with Undersecretary Paula Dobryansky, who, after we reinstituted a democratic government in Afghanistan, we formed the first U.S.-Afghan Women's Council in 2002. Now in its 10th year, by the way, that's one viable organization in Afghanistan, notwithstanding ongoing threats by the Taliban that still exists. Just recently, before I came up, we were talking about the role that I played as Director for Asia and Near East in the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. And in that job, I collaborated with governments, international organizations, and financial institutions to build home country capacity and reintegrate vulnerable populations, particularly women and children. And my responsibilities included oversight of U.S. funding for the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, the International Organization for Migration, and other key non-governmental organizations. But again, I just want to emphasize that I didn't start my career thinking I was going to do these things. They all seem to have fallen in place. During my tenure as ambassador to the Republic of Fiji, Nauru, Kiribati, and the Kingdom of Tonga and Tuvalu, which this picture actually represents, I dealt extensively with the issue of trafficking in persons, which affects women disproportionately. And within 7 months of my arrival, we were able to redesignate Fiji as a Tier 2 country, which before they were a Tier 3 country, made them subject to sanctions for trafficking in persons, and got them to comply with the Trafficking in Persons Victims Protection Act, even though I was amidst an ongoing struggle with that government who had recently undergone a military coup against its democratically elected government. So while I was not able to return Fiji to democracy during my tenure, I was able to do something about that issue. Peter mentioned that I was the Chargé d'Affaires in 2014 at the U.S. Embassy in Dili, Timor-Leste. And at that time, I directed USAID for the first time to fund 3 women's organizations, non-governmental organizations that focus primarily on political empowerment. So this brings us to where I am today at National Defense University, which is the Department of Defense's flagship for strategic education and partnership capacity building, preparing both civilian and military national security professionals to meet the contemporary security environment's challenges. And women, peace, and security is becoming an integral part of our curriculum. At NDU, our graduates leave with an understanding that effective leadership is based on a whole of government approach. That approach rests on 4 pillars: good governance, rule of law, religious freedom, and gender equality. And so, with my own background, it came as no surprise, at least to me, that I was asked to begin to partner with other senior military schools, particularly the Naval War College, to develop and implement an approach on women, peace, and security that would make this part of the permanent curriculum for joint professional military education. As a matter of fact, next spring, I will teach an elective on women, peace, and security at the Eisenhower School. So now it's time, though, to let's think about how women, peace, and security can be an effective part of your curriculum here at CMC. And I hope today's conversation is going to inaugurate this process. So let's begin with where we are. When President Obama issued Executive Order 13595 on December 19, 2011, an issue of significant international importance became a national security priority. His mandate called for federal agencies' development and institution of a national action plan on women, peace, and security, the core of which would be a gender-responsive approach to all diplomatic, development, and defense-related work in conflict-affected environments. It reflects the continual growth of political consideration for gender issues, particularly when within warring contexts. Now, this began in the United Nations system, but one of the things that makes it important that we have an executive order is that the resolution that we're talking about, 1325, was not adopted by the United Nations Security Council under Chapter 7, which meant that it is an obligatory resolution, but not a mandatory resolution. So the importance of the President's executive order is that presidential executive orders are kind of like papal bulls, all right, given the fact that Francis was just here, and that executive orders by the President are rarely rescinded. Sometimes they aren't followed, but they're rarely rescinded. But this executive order compels the federal government to take action primarily by the Departments of State, Defense, USAID, and Treasury. But the Security Council resolutions also address a significant gap, that of the perspective which can be gained from taking a gender lens to matters of global peace and security. Gender, mind you, is a concept that captures and explains the ways that our societies construct ideas of being masculine and feminine, and the ways that power is associated with resulting gender identities, norms, and values. These resolutions recognize that as a result of these gender norms, insecurity, conflict, and violence are experienced differently by men, women, boys, and girls, and that there is a need to overcome the ways in which the concerns, interests, and needs of these vulnerable populations have been excluded from issues of international peace and security. So these resolutions now call for increased participation of women in peace and security related initiatives. And these initiatives are such as women's participation in conflict resolution and peace building. They emphasize the active role women play in conflict prevention and the need for support for these roles. And they make the provision for the protection of women and girls from violence during and after conflict. States are implementing these resolutions around the globe through their domestic, their security, military, and foreign policies. And to date, 53 countries have developed roadmaps for implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 1325. And let me quote, according to the UN, the Secretary General has encouraged all member states, regional organizations, and United Nations entities to review existing implementation plans and targets ahead of the 2015 high-level review. The 2015 high-level review, mind you, is going to occur in New York in the second week of October. And that study will highlight examples of good practice, implementation gaps and challenges, and priorities for actions. The results will then be included in the Secretary General's annual report to the Security Council in 2015 and will be made available to all member states. The study will also build on findings of 2 high-level studies on women, peace, and security that were undertaken in 2002 and lessons from the 10th anniversary in 2010. And the diplomatic representatives of the 5 countries that presided over the Security Council resolutions when they were adopted will be Namibia, the United States, which presided over 3 of them, Vietnam, United Kingdom, and Azerbaijan. And this is again important because throughout history, women have been and remain the most underutilized agents of progress in conflict-prone, conflict-ridden, and post-conflict societies. In spite of their disenfranchisement and a fundamental lack of access to traditional power structures, they have consistently overcome opposition and effected meaningful change. Rather than retreat in silence when women have systematically been shut out of the conversation, they act as galvanizers who strategically mobilize pressure outside of it. When diplomatic talks stall and factions either fail or diametrically refuse to reconcile their differences, we've seen time and time again women procure peace by skillfully and successfully organizing across cultural and sectarian divides. The examples are numerous, but just a few can be seen where the Somali and Ugandan facilitators who brokered peace agreements in the aftermath of decades of bloodshed. In Colombia, our female counterparts formed a coalition against the civil war and societal militarization. Following the Rwanda genocide, women activists led the processes of reconstruction and reconciliation. And so we've seen this time and time again around the world. So therefore, we understand that the critical issues of human rights, security, justice, employment, and healthcare ought to be at the very core of disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration planning, even though they're often neglected. So again, When allowed to participate effectively in any discussion, women bring these issues to the forefront. Through organizations and as individuals, they provide social services and support that not only act as essential complements to formal programs, but in some instances wholly replace them. So, this now leads us to National Defense University. As I mentioned, in response to President Obama's policy directive, and in accordance with its own mission, NDU is working to develop and implement a responsive strategy. This hasn't been an easy task. As a matter of fact, most of my tenure at NDU, I felt more like a suffragette than anyone else. And actually, that's not too far off, because I'm sure all of you in the audience are familiar with the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention, which galvanized many of these issues. But that said, it was important to convince my fellow military academics that the study of women, peace, and security, again, is not a focus on gender promotion, gender prerogatives, or gender preference. It was an approach on operational effectiveness. So, in order to overcome the entrenched bureaucracy of National Defense University, where there was great resistance to this notion of women, peace, and security, simply because of its association with those other issues, and that somehow that the military would be undermined by full participation of women, I began an insurgency, an asymmetrical approach to incorporating women's issues in the overall curriculum. I started by creating a Women, Peace, and Security lecture series, then a university-wide writing award, and finally this spring I was asked to do an elective. But an elective is still not part of the overall curriculum. So we still have a long way to go when we start thinking about the full integration of women's and peace and security issues in joint professional military education. However, I must say that my familiarity with bureaucracy and how to overcome the residual, I would say, resistance by bureaucracies was a result of my taking time to focus on Karl Marx Weber as opposed to Karl Marx. You guys got that one, all right? But most importantly, the focus on women, peace, and security at National Defense University has contributed immensely to more intra-college resolutions. These include development of an issue taxonomy on the basis of which efforts could be organized, the solicitation of expert recommendations with respect to course content and research literature that will encompass the issue's scope, and the compilation of a list of potential speakers and panelists to promote women, peace, and security issues. So, now that we've begun to focus on how to make the strategic vision that we share on incorporating women, peace, and security, we now have to figure out how to implement this shared body of knowledge. At NDU, we actually published a book that was jointly written by then Secretary Hillary Clinton and Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta, entitled Women on the Front Lines of Peace and Security, which was a compilation of essays by senior officials ranging from the Secretary General of NATO and ministers from other countries. But as at the same time, we have to understand that the subject of women, peace, and security and the development of an international agenda and a body of knowledge cannot remain in discrete circles. We have to broaden the dialogue at all levels to identify and share these strategies amongst those countries that have implemented their own national action plans. And so we now move that focus from just the United States, but internationally. But most important, we have to understand, how does this affect us here at CMC? All right? What can we do at CMC as we prepare for our future strategic global leaders? That's you, all right? With the majority of the students in the government department being women, I thought this was a good place to start this process. In my discussions at the Kravitz Leadership Institute on strategic leadership, I emphasized that strong leaders have an understanding of the relationship between the past, the present, and the future. This is how you begin to develop your vision. So in that regard, you have to understand that your relationship as students, practitioners, and future leaders are all linked. And so we make these links because you cannot wait until you graduate to begin to understand the importance of these issues, to begin to make these issues part of your practicum. You have to do it now. And so for you as future strategic leaders, and I like to directly quote what we say to our military officers, you have to understand how a gendered understanding, perspective, and approach brings to bear a considered understanding of gendered norms and values that we attach to the status of women, men, girls, and boys within a societal institutional context. We have to look at these in a number of areas. One, we have to look at these in the context of advancing peace, national security, economic and social development. We have to look at women, peace, and security in terms of conflict resolution, peace building, countering violent extremism, protection of rights, protection from gender-based harms, protection during and after conflict, access to relief and recovery, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, and of course, leadership. This is what we teach our future military leaders. This is what we expect you to do as you become our next generation of leaders. But we cannot rely on our military planners to make WPS an integral part of policy outcomes. As you pursue your studies and write your term papers and independent studies, you should also consider the need to develop an agenda for those above mentioned international mandates that would include 4 key areas. Your studies have to include why women matter, women's participation in peace process and decision making, women's protection, access, and recovery in crisis environments, women's addition in conflict prevention and disaster response. You have to look now at those 4 key areas as you develop your work. You can't wait until after you graduate. And this academic focus that you would now have would include developing gender doctrine as it relates not just to conflict zones, but also to political empowerment, health, education of women, humanitarian assistance, as well as the formal mechanisms by which aims in these regards may be accomplished. You need to reaffirm that our thinking has to be expanded to include all vulnerable populations to protect them in war and peace. Moreover, to help facilitate the global strategy, we should share this curriculum that we've developed with other institutions and partnering countries. We should also identify opportunities to work with international partners to accomplish a wide range of national security objectives. Sharing common approaches with the international community will ensure a coordinated, cohesive, and coherent global approach. So let me refer you back again to what are our key documents: the President's Executive Order, our existing national action plans, and the DoD implementation of the plan, which are all part of our professional education and training to institutionalize the Women, Peace, and Security agenda. Moreover, to help facilitate the global strategy, we need to share this curriculum we've developed with other academic institutions in partner countries. We should also identify opportunities to work with international partners to accomplish a wide range of national security objectives, as well as the goals of the UN Security Council resolutions. So these resolutions should be an essential part of the Model UN program, of which CMC always feels a winning team. It's up to you to begin sharing common approaches and understandings, not only within the international community, but also here in Claremont as we develop understandings of policies and programs at the local, state, and national levels, because it's up to you to include these concepts in your studies to ensure this coordinated, cohesive, and coherent global approach. So it's imperative then that we meet this challenge with a credible approach at all academic institutions. CMC has to play a leading role, all right? And you have to make that leading role. Because as I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, it's very important to understand where you are as future leaders by making the appropriate links to the past, the present, and the future. And so you are students, soon you will be practitioners, then you will be our future leaders. And then it will be up to you to look at ways in which we can make policy formulation and implementation an essential part of our understanding of women, peace, and security. So, thank you for your comments, and let's open it up to questions.
As you might be already, I'm Timmy Song, and I'm a member of the Sex Trafficking Coalition here at CNC. We're a brand new organization, and we're kind of having an issue with what direction we're going to take as a student organization, whether we're going to try and spread awareness, try and do petitions, or try and support organizations that are supporting anti-sex trafficking movements. And I was wondering what you think would be the most powerful thing for us to do as a student organization on campus. Would it be to spread awareness, or would it actually be to try and support the cause through other organizations?
Well, the first thing, which is why I asked Dr. Uven to pass out copies of my remarks, not because my remarks are great, but again, there's those few key sentences. But you have to understand what is the intellectual paradigm you're going to work from, okay? You have to focus on those issues that are cross-cutting issues to make it clear to yourself what you're going to be addressing. And then, as I mentioned earlier, those four key areas, why women matter, what they can do to be included in the process. But most importantly, understanding that what you're talking about is how to develop a paradigm for working on issues that affect all vulnerable populations. Once you understand that framework that you're developing, then it becomes easier for you to move forward, because then all of your work will be infused with these concepts, and it'll become very, very simple. So I don't think you have to, as such, plan, but more think, all right? And then it will become much more easy for you to look at ways in which this can be incorporated. They're all men. Good. This is good. All right.
Thank you for your talk once again. There was a recent report that since the early 2000s, America has spent over $500 million empowering women in Afghanistan. However, there have been many critics that have said that that aid hasn't really been helpful whatsoever, that the situation has either not improved or it has even gotten worse. Can you comment about that? And can you tell us, have we learned anything from giving that aid to Afghanistan women, and how we can replicate it in the future to make sure that it actually is successful?
We know the success or lack thereof of some of our programs in Afghanistan probably have nothing to do with women as much as they have to do with our overall approach toward Afghanistan. You know, I mentioned earlier that in 2000 and 2002, I served as Deputy Director of the Office for Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh. At that time, those of us in the State Department who were working on Afghanistan issues in the post-bond period, had focused on the fact that it would probably be better to look at ways in which we could work with an Afghanistan that had a weak central government and stronger decentralized provincial governments. That notion basically was kicked out. Those of us at the Department of State who were pushing it were basically told by DOD to go away. All right? That what we were going to do in Afghanistan was to implement what was then a program called Cohen Counterinsurgency, which called for nation building, and it required a strong central government. What we saw in the ensuing period between 2002 and to date, we saw that we didn't have a strong central government in Afghanistan, but in fact, we had a weak central government in Afghanistan. We had a central government that could not address the issues of, for instance, the growing of opium, all right, which, as you well know, is the number one fueler of the Taliban and terrorist interests in Afghanistan. So essentially, we got it wrong, all right? And as a result, by getting it wrong in the beginning, by the way, this is Chatham House rules, right? Right. That subsequent programs weren't successful. So we have to remember that in Afghanistan, starting with the ascension of Zahir Shah as king in 1933, all right, the same year, by the way, that Hitler became chancellor, Afghanistan, up until the mid-90s, was actually a country in which women's rights were accepted. It was only in the Taliban period that we saw this reversal, right? And that reversal was undertaken primarily by the Taliban. The Taliban continues to influence greatly the situation by undermining those attempts to restore the focus on women's equality that existed in Afghanistan during the time of Zahir Shah and the subsequent Soviet-supported government that supported it. So again, if you get it wrong in the beginning, you're probably going to continue to get it wrong. All right. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Charlotte. I'm a senior. Thanks so much for your talk. I'm wondering a little bit about how you feel you identifying as a man has played into you advocating on behalf of issues concerning women's peace and security, because I think there's sort of a general notion that, you know, people who are advocating on behalf of women's issues should be women. But I'm wondering if you feel that you identifying as a man has either helped or harmed, or maybe not a little bit of both, in advocating on behalf of these issues.
Well, you know, that's why I sort of spiced early on my remarks with a reference to Seneca Falls, all right, which brought together women's rights activists, abolitionists, social rights activists in the first half of the 19th century to continue to agitate for outcomes that we're now seeing take place in the 21st century. What I've been trying to promote at NDU through not only my own work as a Foreign Service officer and as an ambassador is that when we talk about an operational doctrine, all right, it only works if everyone agrees on the approach. If only women are in the forefront of promoting women, peace, and security, it then begins to look more like you're talking about what? Gender promotion, gender preference, and gender prerogatives. In the context of the Department of Defense, that's a very toxic mix, right? So I don't feel uncomfortable at all, essentially taking on responsibilities that have been mine throughout my career. As a matter of fact, my daughter, who didn't go to CMC, points out that, like her, I would make a very good Smith woman because of the fact that throughout my career, these issues have been thrust upon me, not necessarily because I sought them out, and they clearly weren't necessarily advantageous to my career, but it just made sense. But the reality of it is that unless you have men and women pursuing these issues, then we'll fall short of our overall goals. And I think I made it very clear that the overall goals are to develop a sustainable strategy and policy formulation to meet U.S. and our global partners' interests. All right? That has nothing to do with gender. Okay?
Hi, thanks so much for your talk. My name is Kate, I'm also a senior. I was just wondering what your opinion is on the United States' role in promoting women's health abroad, because I feel like that's probably a very key issue in improving women's lives worldwide. And so just if you could talk a little bit about how the U.S. should prioritize its policies to better incentivize other nations to improve their health systems for women.
I mean, women's health programs have always been an important part of our development assistance. USAID plays a lead role in doing that. But one of the things that came to the forefront in particular was the U.S. response to the Ebola crisis. We deployed 3,500 personnel just from the military alone. We sent hospital tents, portable hospitals, other practitioners, and we arrived in Liberia and Sierra Leone. We realized that the entire healthcare system was run by women. And so the notion that we were going to deploy to West Africa, meet with senior leaders who, for the most part, weren't women, and resolve the crisis was transformational in the thinking of the Department of Defense and the U.S. military in particular. It became clearer and clearer that when we start thinking about our response and inclusion of women's issues, that we have to think of them not just in conflict areas, but as I mentioned earlier, when it comes to humanitarian assistance and disaster response. Because for the majority of our deployments by the military, they will be for humanitarian assistance and disaster response. This photo, which is actually my signature photo, was taken at a relocation camp in Fiji as a result of a cyclone that hit Fiji. All right. Now, one thing that we do know that as a result of climate change, we are going to find that such storms will occur with greater frequency, greater ferocity, all right, and have greater impact. And so what happened, how this picture was taken, I was suddenly swarmed by these kids in my public diplomacy offices to take a photo. But the context was that it occurred at a relocation camp in a response to disaster, all right? And that as we find, because of climate change, that we're going to be responding to more and more of these, we are going to have to think more and more about how we include more gender-sensitive approaches. Because one of the things I did learn, for instance, in this particular instance, that it was Fiji's military which was responsible for disaster response, was totally inadequate, but it was the non-governmental organization community, which was run largely by women, that was the principal partners that we had in dealing with that. So I think that you'll find that within the U.S. there's greater understanding and sensitivity to the need of adopting these approaches, and these sensitivities are influencing what we're doing now. Okay. Good too? All right. Go ahead.
Okay, I have another question. So when dealing with issues that are deeply culturally rooted, such as genital mutilation and other sort of cultural laws that would say that women can advocate for themselves in the court of law, how do you approach that from a diplomatic sense in terms of being respectful to their culture, but as well as saying that this is not actually going to help, this is a practice that is harming women deeply and is harming them both physically and psychologically? How do you approach that?
Well, actually, we take a very simple approach that criminal behavior is not culturally sensitive behavior. All right, so genital mutilation is wrong. Okay, trafficking is wrong. Using sexual violence as a weapon of war is wrong. Okay, so we don't accept cultural excuses for bad behavior. It's extremely difficult to overcome. You may have just seen in the news recently about, again in Afghanistan, the tendency of some local leaders to abuse young boys. All right, that's totally unacceptable to us. All right, and so what we have to do is figure out ways in which we balance our objectives in the field with our own values. And so it can never be an excuse to say that this is something that's culturally based to accept. Yeah. And that's just not my view, by the way.
Going forward, are there any areas in particular that you want to see advancing gender equality? Any particular areas of the world, perhaps?
Well, I think as I tried to go through as I sort of read my remarks, the area that we have to focus on is moving from a common intellectual framework as to what we're going to address. All right, and there's no limit on the areas. I think I gave a list of about just 14 just in foreign policy, but I think that they also apply at the local, state, and federal level. Simply because the one aspect of leadership that we tend to forget is that good leaders behave ethically. Okay, all right, and so adopting good strategies on women, peace, and security also is synonymous with good ethical behavior. All right, and understanding the relationship that good ethical behavior has on all issues in your own personal behavior, you will then begin to see that it is limitless where your focus is going to be. The question is, do you have the appropriate understanding of what are the metrics that I'm going to use to achieve these goals? Isabel.
You mentioned that the UN is leading certain efforts to evaluate the success of different WPS, national action programs in various countries. I understand it's probably easier to evaluate things that are numerical, like physical women in different posts. But how does the UN evaluate softer things like acceptance of FINAC or acceptance of the ocean?
Well, it's funny. That evaluation, or essentially, is nothing more than a readout by the Security Council, is hampered by the fact that I mentioned earlier that Women, Peace, and Security was adopted under Chapter 6 of the UN Charter, which means that it is obligatory but not mandatory. So it becomes incumbent upon states to adopt or pass appropriate legislation, or in the case of the United States, issue presidential executive orders, because as you can well imagine, that Women, Peace, and Security legislation will not pass through this Congress, that we can attain these things. All right, so the UN basically helps set benchmarks, all right? But remember, even the United States, as a supporter of some of these initiatives within the executive branch. And mind you, I'm not pointing my fingers at Republicans or Democrats. I think I noted that in 1988, it was Bush 41 that appointed our first ambassador to the Commission on the Status of Women. That countries have to have the initiative from within to make sure that these policies are implemented the right way. Those initiatives, as I was stressing earlier, come and start with you and the body of work that you're going to create that so that we can have these sustainable policies, not because the UN is issuing another report. So.
I think we'll have to stop now because it's 1 o'clock. Let me allow to thank Ambassador McGann for his talk here.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Thank you. And let me just tell you that Ambassador McGann will have 2 more events today. One is at 2 o'clock. There will be a Dwyer Scholars question and answer session in Crevice 365. And the other one is that at 4 p.m. there will be a Claremont International Relations Society students' coffee and tea time with the ambassador in the same space, Crevice 365. So you're all welcome to attend that event.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr.
And I also want to point out that all those great sentences that my executive forced me to read, Peter will have available
Yes.
for you. All right.
Ask me.
But I think we'll find that the Q&A sessions we can do a deeper dive on some of these issues. All right. Thank you.
Thank you all.
All right.
Thank you, sir.